All right, so for those of you who weren't here, I guess, last session, we're going to have a little bit of a review of what we talked about, and then we're going to move into some new territory. Okay? So like I said, this class is covering the 13 principles of faith, roughly philosophy of Judaism. That's what we'll, for the sake of being non-ambiguous, that's what we'll call it. So this class is on the 13 principles of faith. So we started out with a brief introduction about, well, why did God create the world? As our starting point to kind of start, make sense of Judaism, we got to go way back. We got to go way back before creation itself. And we find in Kabbalah this idea, especially with the Ramchal and his Talmud Ashlam, that the purpose of creation was to learn how to love. To learn how to love. Love is a complex topic. We're actually going to break down what love involves a little bit. But what was going on was that when we were created, it was almost kind of imagine yourself as all these little neshamas floating around in Shemayim. We're hanging out with God, and God is just pouring love towards us, and we don't have the foggiest idea why. What the heck is going on? Why does God love us? And the way the Kabbalists kind of describe it is almost like this intense feeling of embarrassment and confusion. Like, well, why are you treating me this way? Why are you caring about me? There was no reference point, or there was no. It was just out of nowhere. And you kind of imagine somebody you never met, you never knew, just coming up and just giving you a hug and professing their undying love. We'd call the cops. That's weird. And that's exactly what God was doing. So we had the most normal response any person could have is, God, you're weird. And so Hashem takes a double take and says, okay, we got to straighten this one out. And he created the world. He created a place where we could figure out what love is. So if you kind of think about it, the world is a laboratory of love. And the function of the Torah is to help us, guide us along in figuring out how to navigate this weird love laboratory. Now, I mentioned in the last class, my day job is I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a therapist, and so this idea that Kabbalah kind of reminds me of this researcher named John Gottman. Really cool guy. He's also Jewish. He's a Orthodox Jew. And, before he came along, his main research was in marriage. And before he came along, a lot of people had a lot of really weird ideas about what love and marriage, how does marriage work? And there was some wild stuff in the world of psychology. I mean, there was one therapy that didn't last long where, couples would come in and the therapist would say, okay, well, let's work, this idea that you have to work out your anger and just express how angry you are at everybody. So he would actually give foam bats to the couple. Foam bats, right? And the idea of this wild therapy was, well, you just yell at your spouse while you're upset at them and hit them with a foam bat. And the idea is you're getting your rage out and somehow this would make the marriage work. I have no idea why this guy thought this. He was a well-respected clinical researcher and therapist, but man, was that a dumb idea. And so what John Gottman did was he said, okay, well, let's actually do some research on this. And he created something called the Love Lab in Seattle, where he basically took an entire apartment and invited couples from all walks of life. This thousands and thousands of couples have gone through this apartment, and the whole place was jury rigged with different sensors, and it was taking your heartbeat the entire time, and it was measuring how much you're sweating, and and the videotapes were all over the place in some new ways, obviously. And it was observing, well, what do couples that have good marriages do? And what do couples that have bad marriages do? And so you look him up, a lot of really cool research, and he created one of the most successful marital therapies that exist today. But it's kind of like that. The world is exactly like that. This idea of God watching us and considering our actions, and we just had Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the Book of Life, the Book of Death. Well, it's like God's being a little bit like John Gottman, and we're in his love lab. So what's love? there's about, I'd say roughly 7 different aspects to love, and this is why it's so complicated. Because you kind of kind of make a few jokes when I mentioned it. Love, as though it's a simple concept. But I mean, for number one, that researcher with the foam bats, he was an intelligent man and really missed the boat. His idea of developing love was hitting people with foam bats and screaming at each other. Like, okay, interesting idea. And we can kind of laugh about it, but he really, and I'm presenting it in a funny way, but he had his reasons. And even in our own experiences, I can't imagine anybody here can swear that they actually worked out how to have a decent relationship with no problems. Love's hard. You talk to people who've been married more than 3 years, and you can tell who has no idea about marriage and who does when the way they ask questions to these married couples. And it's like, man, you guys must really love each other. You stayed together for this long. And married couples who've actually gone through being married will laugh. And no, I mean, yeah, we like each other. That's true. We do love each other. But it's not, the marriage isn't working because we're seeing stars and little pink hearts flying all over the place. It's commitment. And that is hard. You survive marriage and reap the benefits because it's nice, those benefits. But it's a type of survival. It's not simple. So love is not simple. Your first fight in a relationship will teach you that. So breaking down love, what does love involve? Because when we have a sense of that, we're going to be able to have a better appreciation for halacha and these 13 principles of faith that the Rambam outlined. The first idea is loyalty. It's the first concept of love. Of figuring out a way to be a little less of an individual and sacrifice a little bit of yourself for the greater good of the couple. It's actually giving up your identity, not entirely, but to some extent. The opposite of that is autonomy. Being able to stand your ground in a relationship and not giving up who you are. And that's a paradox right there. Every fight in a relationship is based on these two things that interplay. At what point do you give in, and what point do you stand up for your principles? I mean, that's 80% of fights. Not just in marriage, but in life. A part of being autonomous is not just working out where to stand your ground, but also making a separation and figuring out how much of the problems of my friend or spouse, how much of that am I going to take on as a burden to help and care and be supportive? And how much am I going to let them work it out themselves? There's definitely something to the idea of don't steal other people's problems. No one wants to have problems. But, as far as things go in terms of learning how to work out oneself, working through problems is a pretty effective way of becoming a better human being. If you steal that from a person, you're basically stealing their ability to improve themselves. So this is the first complexity of love. How much do you sacrifice who you are, and how much do you not? The third aspect of love deals with harm, and the fourth, fairness. This everyone relates to across the board. There's an amazing researcher, look him up, he's a cool guy, Jonathan Haidt. And his research is actually very much based on these 7 principles. And he's kind of moved more towards trying to figure out why there's such political upheavals today. Why do people have political fights? And what he found is that the basic difference between, say, liberals or conservatives or Democrats, Republicans, is how much emphasis they put on these 7 principles. Everybody buys into harm and fairness. In fact, that's the basis of being liberal or being a Democrat, let's say, is you want to reduce harm to the biggest extent possible and increase fairness to the best of your ability. And that more or less covers liberal politics, but it also covers how we ourselves relate to other people. We don't want to hurt people. We want to be as fair as we can to others. But when it comes to a relationship, And getting back to the first two principles I mentioned, we also have to figure out a way that we don't end up harming ourselves and we're fair to ourselves. I can't speak to the experience, because I've never been a woman. But being a woman, I think, in many ways is harder than being a man. Women are biologically more agreeable than men. You look at prison, that's one reason of understanding why there's so many men in prison. It's like 92% of the population, of people in prison are men, because men are really disagreeable, very disagreeable, and women aren't. A part of this can kind of be thought of as like, women have babies, they have to take care of other people. That's how they're built. That's one idea some researchers give. But for our purposes here, it's important to kind of keep this one on your radar, is because, the more agreeable you are, the more you give, the more room for resentment there's going to be in your life. Because you give and give and give, and this deadbeat guy, what does he give? Now, I'm exaggerating a classic debate in couples, but that really is, the other half of fights is women are really giving, and guys are they're more disagreeable. It's usually, when marriages are falling apart, it's usually women that are the ones that are pushing to keep the thing going, to their detriment, many times. One reason why there's been such a spike in the divorce rate, interestingly enough, is that women are starting to develop professions and develop their own interests, and they have the money to leave these disagreeable guys. So these two factors, harm and fairness, the other aspect of love, that we want to be fair and we want to not hurt people, but again, it gets more complex because you don't want to land yourself in these sort of situations. You want to be fair to yourself and not come out being harmed yourself. The next is authority. A sense of there are people that we can learn from. Is the next aspect of love. Whether it's looking to our own parents or couples that we know that have done a great job staying together and looking at them as models, as authorities of how to live in a loving relationship. And again, this idea kind of links back into how much we give up our own identities in wanting to be a part of a community. Authority at the very end of it is really just a hierarchy of, where's your place in a group. One thing that really surprised me, but it made a lot of sense afterwards, but this idea of what do people need to survive? Oxygen definitely is on the list. Food and water, we definitely want those. But we need love to literally survive. There was a famous researcher, John Bowlby, who did a lot at the turn of the century. He was a doctor, and it was a pediatric doctor. And what he noticed was just how much better kids get along when their mother, at that time, but now, dads need to do this too, but when their moms were just there for their kids, and how much kids just seem to develop much more nicely when they got a lot of hugs and kisses. Recently, later, a couple decades after, when Romania was going through these weird political communist upheavals, they got a lot of weird ideas going on in Romania, but whatever, they ended up having a lot, for different reasons, they had a lot of kids and they were all ending up in orphanages without parents. Their parents couldn't take care of them. And what they were finding in these Romanian orphanages, kids were just dying. And they were getting food. They were getting formula. They were being taken care of physically in that sense. But what people started to notice is, well, if you wanted to reduce those mortality rates, pick up the kid and give him a kiss. We survive based on love. The same way we survive based on food and water. That's linked to authority because, you can only really get love, caring in a group. We can't just, in a certain way, in order for that group to be able to survive and continue on and not get too crazy, you have to have some sort of order. But that's the fundamental principle of authority is as a way of harnessing human love where everybody can be a part of the group and matter. It's probably a good way of thinking about it. And naturally, some people are on the top and some people lower, but everyone's a part of the group. The next is the idea of freedom. It's an essential part of love. And freedom's a funny thing. You know, freedom is very much almost like in our heads in a certain respect. Because the idea of being able to look into the future realistically, that's kind of what makes you free. It's not living in the moment, but being able to plan your actions and to be able to anticipate, well, what's going to happen in the future, and to learn from your past. You know, the behavioral researchers, they've done the most research with animals. So if you want to learn about animal psychology, learn behaviorism. And what they found is, you know, this point, this thing that makes us free and animals not, is our ability to be able to see into our pasts and to see into our futures. We don't exactly live in the present. You know, this greatness that liberates us from our baser instincts, let's say, from our taivas, also ends up thwarting us. This is the wrinkle in this particular factor. Because we end up sometimes getting a little too stuck in the past and a little too stuck in the future. That's depression and anxiety. Worrying and ruminating about what happened leads you right to depression.
That's the actual definition?
That is the actual definition.
What is the actual definition?
Depression is linked to rumination.
To what?
To rumination, that you keep thinking about what you did over and over and over and over and over, and you just don't get to a solution. You just keep rehashing that mistake you made, or what that person said to you, or that experience in your life, and there's no push forward, there's no resolution, there's no answer. Just being stuck in that moment over and over and over again. Being trapped in the past.
And anxiety is...
Sure.
And the anxiety is worrying too much about the future. Like they overthink.
Anxiety is fear of the future. Anxiety is fear of the future.
Thank you.
And so we have this amazing ability to bring the future and the past into the present. That's human greatness. But man, does it cause problems. Especially now, you know, this one scared me. You know, I don't know, here in Israel, especially in the Haredi communities, I never really bought into the whole, like, you know, iPhones are bad thing. Like, I really didn't. It was only until this year that I paused and saw. You ever go to Shmuel and Navi Bar Ilan on Friday? You ever been there in the afternoon? And they have yeah, it's near there. Yeah. And they have I don't know if they have them now, but they used to have this group of guys. I thought the whole thing was comical, where they were, like, you know, screaming. You know, they had this little kid on a loudspeaker, like, moaning, "Oh, you know, mom and dad, oh, help me! Like, I'm, you know, oh, you know, like, I'm suffering because of the internet." And, like, I thought the whole thing was funny. Until I started looking into the research about why it is that in the United States, anxiety and depression are on the rise, like, dramatically. Not just a little bit on the rise. Starting really with 2004, 2009, when iPhones started to actually become popular. Yes. And now, I'm mentioning it because it's mostly women that are suffering. Men not so much, because men who, you know, when the iPhone comes up, you know, what's on a guy's iPhone? Games. He looks at games, he plays around. That's what guys do. You know, they love computer games. Girls are on the social media, and what seems to have happened is this amplification of social judgment on social media occurs more with women, and it was like the suicide rates for women, like, skyrocketed 80%. 80. And it's only rising in the United States. Other places in the world is actually becoming less and less. So I started to laugh a little less and take a little more seriously the guys at Shmuel and Levi Bar Ilan, you know, with their scary kid protests. But a part of that is because we get stuck in the future and we get stuck in the past. The last quality of love is this idea of kedusha, sanctity. Things are special inherently. They don't need a reason. There's no obvious quality to the thing that tells you, oh yes, this is holy. It just is. You know, why is a building made of wooden bricks special? A shul. We call that holy. It's a bunch of bricks. It's a bunch of wood. But there's something in us that drives us to recognize that this place is special. We make things meaningful. And that's sanctity. So taking these 7 aspects, we have a full picture of what love is. And I hope my agenda was to try and make it sound complicated, because it is. Love is a serious business. And so it makes a lot of sense that when God created us, and like this perfect stranger coming up to give us a hug, here's a bunch of love. It's like, man, what are you doing? We have to become love researchers to understand that. And that's the purpose of the world. So based on that, enter stage left, the Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith. Foundations of Judaism. What I want to kind of tackle today is, well, what's the connection between the 13 principles and love? How do they relate to each other? And as we work out that question, I hope we can also answer another more important question, is the differences between religions in general. So the Rambam himself, he was, one reason why he became so popular with the Jews of Yemen, they were going through a horrible oppression. Over there, the Islamic authorities were really coming down hard on the Jews. So the Rambam took a special interest in that community and was constantly writing them letters of encouragement. And in one letter, I read it and it struck me, and it was like so true and so disturbing, was how he said that basically all religions are kind of the same. And so that got me thinking. I saw this 4 years ago, and I've been bothered by it ever since. And so I hope that actually, what I'm going to tackle here today is going to answer that problem. Because, if every religion is basically the same, we'll flip a coin and do what you want. But that's obviously not the case. We do intuitively sense religions are different. So we're gonna kind of tackle that problem in making this connection between the 13 principles of the Rambam and the laboratory of love. So last session, we defined what those 13 principles were. And to break it down into, in a more user-friendly sort of way, they really make 3 different groups of ideas. The first 5 were we're basically dealing with the nature of God. And when we start going through the text itself of the Rambam, he actually proves those using logic and using reason to justify, these principles are not just things we get from tradition. They're not just some bright idea those rabbis with the big long white beards gave us, but they're based on actual logic and reason. You can observe the universe. You can use develop proofs, and we can actually justify the existence of God outside of religion, outside of theology. So those are the first 5, defining the nature of God. Principles 6 through 9, we're defining the nature of the Torah. What's Torah? What does it do? And the last 3 principles, we're dealing with how God interacts with man, how our actions are judged. To what extent have we understood what love is? That's what's on the line in our lives. A lot of people like shying away from these 3, but it's worth kind of pausing on them a little bit. This idea of we are actually like I said we went through Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we're actually judged, and I can understand why that's actually kind of a scary idea, and and I think definitely a lot of different rabbis have done a good job of making that idea unnecessarily disturbing and scary. So I understand there's a lot of history with this sort of idea. But I wanted to offer, when looking at these, is the idea that anything that is valuable or anything that is worth anything in your life, wherever there's a value, there's pain. Wherever there's a value, there's a standard that we automatically are being judged against. When we say something's important to us, we're automatically saying other things aren't. And we do measure ourselves and others based on those important values. And so for the Rambam, he's very unique in this, and we'll get more into it when we get there, but he's very unique amongst all the other different rabbis because he didn't look at it as God punishing anybody. He didn't really have a concept of hell. Not like, say, the Ramban, who did. There definitely are other rabbis who disagree with the Rambam. I just happen to like the Rambam more. I find it more sophisticated. That it's this idea of, say, heaven and hell are really just more of a continuum of how much did you understand love? How much did you understand God? And the more in this world you were able to understand God, the more you were able to understand love, the more you will be able to recognize those ideas in the next world. Simple as that. No one's being punished. It's just a matter of how much you're going to be able to recognize how good these things are. Yeah.
I don't get it. What do you mean? Like, you're saying in the world to come, there is going to be love and there's going to be love in the world to come?
Yep. That's all it is. That's all it is.
It's not like physical. Okay.
That's all it is. That's all it is.
So you're saying if we don't really recognize it, truly here, we're not going to recognize it that well?
Exactly. Yes.
And let's say somebody thinks they recognize it, but they really don't.
Then they're not going to there.
So how are they supposed to know they don't really recognize it?
They take my class. They have Judaism to rely on. That's why Torah is so important. That's why the Jewish mission is so important. Because we actually offer that to the world. 100%. I know I'm joking a little bit, but that really is the answer. Okay. So it's almost kind of like the way that you exit this world is the way you're going to be for eternity. I don't know what else sounds more like hell than that. Like if you really, really, really don't get it, man, that's not. I don't want that. That's pretty bad. But it's not a punishment, and that's what makes the Rambam unique. No one's being punished. That's the takeaway from those last three. This idea of judgment. It's how much we realize the values we really do inherently value, how much we end up understanding them, and values do have a value system. No pun intended. Yeah.
How can you say it's not a punishment though, if even in the world to come we're not per se denied, but basically denied that full understanding?
A punishment, yeah.
That we did here.
I mean, what comes across with the idea of punishment is there was an injustice somewhere. That's basically what punishments are for. There's an injustice, and we have to right the injustice. There's a clear criminal that we have to sort him out. That's just not there for the Rambam. No one's bad, and what's nice about this way of looking at judgment is that it enhances this thought of like a common humanity. It's like we're all in this boat together. And there really is nobody bad. I mean, people do bad things, and there's a lot of pain in the world. Like that's for sure. I'm not trying to give excuses to bad people necessarily, but this idea, in a more global way, I guess, enables sneaking in a little bit of compassion. In the sense of no one's really bad. No one's evil. We're all in the same boat. We're all in the same path of life of trying to figure out what love is.
What about murderers and rapists?
Yeah, that's bad. Don't do that.
They're bad. Aren't they bad people?
They did bad things, 100%. Screwed up lives. You really get into research. Oh my gosh, I scarred myself. And what was coming out, geez Louise, they basically don't have. They have the ability to intellectually recognize empathy, but they don't feel it. And so, that's problem number one. And problem number two is they have a very, very, very high threshold to fear and pain. So, they'll do things that you and I would be terrified of doing. It doesn't terrify them at all.
Really born like that.
Really born that way?
Yeah, yes. There's that's the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths.
Yeah,
There's more of an element in sociopaths of the nurture of the life that they were living, basically. But man, I just want.
Psychopaths are born. So
Yeah, good way of putting. Good point. Good way of putting it. Are born. That's a good way of putting it.
What's a sociopath?
Basically the same thing, but it's a little bit. They were kind of born with psychopathic traits, just not to the same extent. But their home life was a car crash.
Right.
So I mean, you put it that way. I mean, you think about a person like that, it's yeah, that guy doesn't do a whole lot of good in life.
probably not gonna go to like.
But at the same time, when you hear the stories of how these people grew up, it's kind of hard not to have some compassion for them. It's kind of hard not to understand, like, okay, like, it's, like, man, like, I was listening to it was like 5 hours of interviews of psychopaths. So halfway through, I just broke out crying what they were describing. You know, it's just don't do it to yourself. But what I'm saying is, like, when you actually then start learning about, you know, their home life, it's like, okay, like, my God, what did you do? And your life was a wreck. Like, it's hard not to feel sad for what they grew up with, what made them who they were. So these 13 principles, you kind of almost imagine, you know, kind of rattle off this nice little list of, you know, what love is. And a part of the complexity is knowing what measure to have in your life. How important is harm? How important is fairness? And that, getting back in a more political way of looking at things, that's really what differentiates different people of political affiliation. It's not so much people disagree that, you know, equality is everyone agrees equality is a good idea. The disagreement is always going to be on what proportion of equality is a good idea. And so these 13 principles, in relation to these ideas of love, they kind of function to kind of set the volume on each. Taking it from maybe a completely different angle is, you know, when you sit down and you actually have to define what God is, when you really have to sit down and define what the Torah is and how God relates to us, you know, those 3 general categories of the 13 principles. You're defining your terms. What's in front of you? It literally makes the difference between when you do a mitzvah, are you doing it for God or are you doing it for a teacup? What do I mean?
For yourself?
What do I mean? What the Rambam was coming to point out was that it's not enough just to say God exists and that's it, and I just do mitzvahs for God. Well, what's God? That's just too abstract. I mean, it's define your terms. When you define things that way, well, you might as well, you know, that very vague definition could be applied to anything: a teacup, a wall, a penguin. You know, if you really don't put so much thought into what you define the thing as, well, that's one way of saying it's not important. It's not important enough to define. So without having a clear definition of what God is, or what the purpose of Torah is, well, how can you ever say that you're keeping the Torah? Or how could you ever say you're actually davening to God? Because you are confronted with, okay, fine, well, what's God? You have to discriminate between that and, say, a teacup or a penguin. So these 13 principles are filling in that gap for us of defining what these things are, so that we can legitimately say, yeah, well, you know, I am trying to relate to God, and I have a fair idea, the best that I can as a human being anyway, I have a fair idea of what God is, as opposed to anything else. So it's these 13 principles that all of halacha rests on. Every mitzvah, you have to have in mind, what is God, what is the Torah, and how does God relate to me? Every single mitzvah needs to have that. To the point where the Rambam literally does say that if you don't have clarity on one of those 3 things, you simply aren't doing a mitzvah. You simply aren't davening to God. Because an essential part of what you're doing is literally missing. I mean, it's kind of almost like kind of trying to write an essay without a pencil. You can't do it. That's what halacha is without these 13 principles. Writing without a pencil. So with having these 13 as the foundation for halacha, and halacha is kind of sitting on that, the whole approach of halacha then is, again, keeping those 3 in mind, but then with every single halacha working out the complexity of love in every single halacha. Vis-a-vis yourself, bein adam la'atzmo. Vis-a-vis other people, bein adam l'chavero. And vis-a-vis God, bein adam l'makom. That's the structure of Judaism. And if you're missing one of those three parts, it simply isn't Judaism. So we can kind of better clarify that other statement that I mentioned about the Rambam in his letters to the Yemenites. Well, yeah, religions are very similar. Religions do have, name me a religion that does not value compassion. Doesn't exist. But it's going to be how far do you turn the dial in all of these 7 ideas? Because if you take a Buddhist, the level of compassion they have for a tree is the same level of compassion they have for a human being.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, so there's different sects of Buddhism, and some more than others. I mean, you definitely have stories of Buddhists not doing nice things. But we'll say for our purposes, generally speaking, yeah. But that's definitely not Judaism. We value people over animals. We value people over plants. That is a value judgment we make that hits almost every one of these 7 ideas of love. Harm means less when you're pruning a rose bush than if you're being a psychopath murdering people. It's simply different. And so that's, I think, what the Rambam meant when he said, yeah, every religion is very similar. They have all these 7, but that's the distinction. How far you move the dial. And the only way to figure out what the Jewish dial is going through halacha. Every halacha is a value judgment that's being made in one of these 7. There was a famous commentary on the Rif. The Rif is one of these guys, one of the Rishonim in the back of the Gemara, and he was one of the first rabbis who organized halacha. And so there was this chutzpahdik, 35, I think he was 35-year-old rabbi, they call him the Baal Ma'or, and he comes along, and his whole commentary on the Rif, he's just slugging him up, battling him left, right, and center, fighting the Rif on every halacha. And so the Ramban, he wrote a counter commentary against the Baal Ma'or. He calls it the Milchamos Hashem, the War of God, he's fighting for God, to defend the Rif. And in his introduction, he spells out this idea I'm trying to describe here. Is he writes that the Gemara and halacha is really on the cusp of what we can really prove in life. They're metaphysical ideas. And he says, I can't exactly prove 100% the Baal Ma'or is incorrect. I can't do it. That's just the nature of values. That's the nature of these ideas. We have to rely on Masorah to a great extent. That's just the nature of the beast. That's how the thing works. But the Rambam says, yeah, but he's wrong. I feel it in my gut. And he goes on, he writes his commentary, slugging him up, all over the place. But just kind of capturing that idea is that, every halacha is a value judgment. That's the setting of the dial that makes Judaism unique. I mean, even the idea that these things are up for debate makes Judaism incredibly unique. Something like we touched on in the last session is, the Rambam, he very much did a dramatic thing, creating these 13 principles. No one ever did it before. Next class we'll get into that a little bit more. And what exactly he was doing there and why. But, he never did it, and wouldn't you know, no one wanted to kill him over it. That's unheard of in religion. People who have different religious ideas. I mean, you think about, even when I go home and I talk religion with friends and family, I'm like, man, that's like a bloodbath. People have very powerful, strong thoughts and feelings about religion, and that makes sense, fair enough. But you look at the history of world religions, like any time in Christianity someone didn't agree with each other, it's a 50 years war. Literally. Just massacring everybody. over value judgments. That makes Judaism unique amongst all other religions. Now, however these 7 ideas, these 7 factors of love are set, on the dial, like how the to what extent each one actually is there. Well, I'll tell you what, the dials are set in such a way that we don't end up cannibalizing each other when we disagree with one another. We're actually open to hearing each other's ideas out. That we can, like the Ramban, the Baal Ma'or, have respect for each other even though we disagree on the most fundamental, the most important ideas of life. That's only because that only comes out of the way that Judaism defines love. You don't kill over it. You grow with it. And the clock's kind of burning out, so I think we'll kind of leave it here. But any thoughts, any questions on what we did today? All right. Take it easy.